You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at the work of Max Ernst. Max Ernst was born April 2nd, 1891, in Bruehl, Germany, a small town near Cologne. He was the third of 9 children in a strict religious Catholic family. His father, Philip Ernst, was a teacher of the deaf and an amateur painter. Interestingly, his father had a very rigid, realistic style of painting, so much so that there's an old story that he once painted a picture of their garden, but felt it looked unbalanced, so he chopped down a real tree to match his painting. This strict adherence to reality and authority was something that Max would spend his entire life rebelling against. As a young man, Ernst didn't initially go to art school. He enrolled at the University of Bonn to study philosophy, art history, literature, psychology, and psychiatry. Psychology is what really grabbed him. He visited asylums and became fascinated by the artwork created by patients. He felt their work had a raw emotional power that was missing in the polished art of the museums. This interest in what some people would call an outsider perspective would become a cornerstone of his future career. But his studies were halted with the outbreak of World War I. Ernst, along with pretty much every other young man, was forced into the military. He served in the German army in the artillery on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The war was a devastating experience. He later wrote in his autobiography a chilling third-person statement. He said, quote, "Max Ernst died the 1st of August, 1914, resuscitated the 11th of November, 1918, end quote. For Ernst, the person he was before the war was just gone. The man who survived was changed forever. He was deeply skeptical of the society and the logic that had led the world into such chaos. After the war, Ernst returned to Cologne, but he had no interest in returning to normal. He helped found the Cologne branch of the Dada movement. Dada wasn't just an art style, it was an anti-art movement. It embraced absurdity, nonsense, and chaos as a way to protest the so-called rational world that had just destroyed itself in the trenches. Ernst, along with friends like Hans Arp, created collages and staged chaotic exhibitions. One famous exhibition was held in a bathroom behind a pub, and visitors were reportedly given axes to destroy the art if they didn't like it. Although this might have been a bit of Dada myth-making. In 1922, the Dada movement was fading, and Ernst moved to Paris. He entered the country illegally using a friend's passport, which kind of fits his persona perfectly. In Paris, he joined a group of writers and artists who were transitioning from Dada to a new movement, Surrealism. Led by André Breton, the Surrealists were less about pure chaos and more about exploring the unconscious mind, dreams, and the strange juxtapositions of realities. Basically, they would put things together in odd combinations using sort of free associations to reveal some deeper truth or hidden meaning from the subconscious mind. Ernst was a tireless experimenter during this time. He was constantly inventing new ways to make art that bypassed his conscious control. One rainy day at a hotel, he stared at the worn floorboards and decided to place a piece of paper over them and rub with a pencil. The texture of the wood grain emerged, creating strange, ghostly shapes. He called this technique frottage, which was the French word for rubbing. He used these textures to spark his imagination, turning wood grain into forests, birds, and strange monsters. But he didn't stop with frottage. He also adapted this technique to painting, calling it grattage. He would scrape wet paint off a canvas that was placed over textured objects. He also used decalcomania, where you press paint between two surfaces and pull them apart to create coral-like organic patterns. For Ernst, these techniques were a way to let the material speak for itself, acting as a bridge to his unconscious mind. You might think of it as sort of like another version of those Rorschach tests or the ink blots that allow you to look at seemingly randomly created designs and try to make new connections for yourself. As the 1930s progressed, the political climate in Europe was changing. World War II was on the horizon, and Ernst was in a really perilous position. In France, he was considered an enemy alien because he was German, and he was interned in prison camps. But the Nazis in Germany also hated him. His work had been labeled degenerate art and mocked in the infamous exhibitions. He really didn't feel safe anywhere in Europe. Fortunately, the American art collector Peggy Guggenheim came to his rescue. She helped Ernst escape Europe in 1941, and they eventually married, although that didn't last for long. Ernst settled in the United States, eventually moving to Sedona, Arizona. The dramatic red rock landscapes and the art of the Hopi and Zuni people deeply influenced his later work. He loved the desert with the strange rock formations echoing the dreamscapes he had been painting for years. In Arizona, he happily spent his days making art and also playing chess. He loved the game and often played against Marcel Duchamp. He built his own house and created sculptures that looked like totems standing guard in the desert. His time in America was crucial because, along with other exiled artists, he helped introduce surrealism and these avant-garde artistic ideas to young American painters, which paved the way for movements like abstract expressionism. Eventually, in 1953, he returned to France, where he continued his work until he passed away in 1976. And he left behind a large body of work that was heavily influential on fellow artists, but also extremely personal. Throughout his life, he often identified himself with a bird character he called Loplop, the superior of birds. Loplop appeared in many of his paintings and collages, acting as a sort of alter ego, a guide through the strange, wonderful, and sometimes frightening world of Max Ernst's imagination. Now, I want to take a closer look at one of his pieces, Forest and Dove. A Forest and Dove is oil on canvas. It was created in 1927, and it's about 39 inches tall by 32 inches wide. When you first look at it, you get this sense of mystery, even a bit of a spooky claustrophobia. The painting is dominated by a dense, dark, impenetrable wall of what looks like trees, but more menacing than the trees you encounter in your daily life. They're not painted with a traditional brush. They have a rough, almost sculptural texture. The colors are murky, dark greens, browns, blacks, suggesting a forest at twilight, or perhaps in a nightmare. And at the center of this dark mass, there's this glowing, halo-like ring. Tucked away inside that dark, dense forest, we see a little dove. There's a striking contrast between the dark, rough forest and the bright white. It grabs your attention. It's calling out to you as basically the first thing you see as a focal point in the work. Now, this painting is an example of that grattage technique I mentioned earlier. To create the forest texture, Ernst didn't paint the trees, he discovered them. He took a canvas that was painted with layers of dark paint, and while it was still wet, he pressed it onto a piece of rough wood. He then scraped some paint off. The wood grain underneath poked through the remaining paint, creating these strange ribbed patterns that look like ancient fossilized tree trunks. It's important to remember that Ernst often used birds as a stand-in for himself, typically that alter ego, Loplop. Here, the bird is rendered in a very sort of rough, almost childlike way. And I feel like this is important because surrealists valued the art of children. They felt that children were unfiltered and direct in their communication, not yet bogged down by the rules of society. By painting a bird in a childish way, Ernst is suggesting a purity of expression and an innocent, dreamlike state. But this childlike sort of style also makes the bird feel a bit vulnerable. Because it looks like something created by a child, it's so simple, the dove seems even more fragile against the backdrop of that dark, imposing, ancient-looking forest. For me, it creates this feeling of like a small, innocent spirit trying to exist within a confusing, overwhelming world. It captures that feeling we all have sometimes of being small and delicate in the face of a big, scary reality. Of course, it's not just about that personal expression. Part of the reason we talk about a work like Forest and Dove is because it was also influential on other artists and the works that they created. And pieces like this changed the way that artists in the early 20th century thought about making paintings. Ernst showed that you don't need to carefully plan every brushstroke to create a powerful image. By using techniques like grattage, he allowed chance and accident to play a role in the creative process. He showed that sometimes the material itself, a piece of rough wood or a glob of paint, could suggest an idea to the artist rather than the artist always forcing their ideas onto the material.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.